It gives me great pleasure to invite Mr. Phillip Wong, Managing Director and Chief Executive Officer, SOCAM Develoipment Limited, a member of the Shui On Group, to deliver his introductory remarks. Mr. Wong, please.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining this keynote luncheon. As a sponsor of this event, we find the theme of this summit extremely meaningful. There are three key words: APEC, SMEs, and entrepreneurship. I believe you will agree with me that Asia-Pacific entrepreneurial SMEs are the key growth engine of this region and also of global economies. Hong Kong's success story is fundamentally built on successful SMEs led by very visionary entrepreneurs. Some of these SMEs start the business in the 60s and 70s, has now been transformed into large conglomerates and corporations. They contribute a lot to the growth of Hong Kong and also China. Our speaker, Dr. William Fung of Lee & Fung Group, will share with us his experience in reinventing the family business to attain sustainable growth. The moderator, Mr. Vincent Low of Shui On Group, my boss, is also a success story of APEC entrepreneurial SMEs. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure that we will have plenty to take away from this keynote speech. And I would also like to thank TDC in organizing this event. And now, please join me to welcome Dr. William Fung, please.
And let me turn off my phone. Philip, thank you very much. Go and sit over there.
Maybe I should just give a very brief word of introduction on William, whom I'm sure is a stranger to our audience here. William, he's now the Executive Deputy Chairman of Lee & Fung. In 1970, William graduated from Princeton University, Bachelor of Science in Engineering, and then in 72, he graduated MBA from Harvard, and then he joined the Lee & Fung Group, the trading company, in 72, and then he served as Director of Export Business in 76. But in 73, he and his brother took Lee & Fung public and raised only 20-odd million Hong Kong dollars. But the company was very popular, and it was 113 times oversubscribed, which was probably a record at that time. So you can imagine, Lee & Fung at that time total market was only about 100 million Hong Kong. Today, guess what it's worth? 145 billion yesterday closing price. It's amazing how he and Victor have really taken the company to such level and success. And then actually another interesting strategy that they practiced was in 88, he and Victor privatized the company and then reorganized the business. And I'm sure we'll hear more about it later on. And then in 92, they relisted the company and only raised 275 million Hong Kong at that time. So it's really an amazing story. And William and I are very good personal friends. We've known each other for 30-odd years. So when we met in 76, he told me that he was running the family trading business. And I have to admit now, William, I was so sympathetic to you. I was thinking, this poor guy, you know, working in this sunset business and small trading company, what is he going to do? Little did I know that he would really one day become the really the king of supply chain. So let's ask William to share with us his experience and knowledge of how he has reinvented the family business. William.
Maybe I should stand up. Good afternoon, everyone. Philip, thank you very much for your kind introduction. And Vincent, thank you for making me blush. I would like to share, our story with you. But really, I think our story is actually not alone. There are many, many companies like ours, starting in this part of the world because of several things. And what I thought I would do with you is basically to tell you how, going back to the theme of this meeting, how an SME situated and working in this part of the world can actually take advantage of some of the global trends to really accelerate its growth and become fairly large companies in a relatively short time. And I think our story is really quite typical of that. And of course, first perhaps I would just talk about some of the global trends that underlie this market that allows companies that are fairly small in this part of the world to grow quickly. And of course, then I will talk a little bit about our view about China, which is obviously the big accelerator in the last 30 years. So I've been working now in Hong Kong for about 40 years. And as Vincent rightly pointed out, we were, of course, a very small company. It was, in fact, Vincent was right. When we took the company public, when we first came back from overseas to join my family company, the company was about 1,000 times smaller than what it is today. And even after we took it public in '92, which is the last 20 years, the company was, now about 120, 130 times bigger. But that's the sort of growth that you can not expect, but that's possible in this area where you are catching just the right world trends in the right place, and then also with the growth of China, you're really well situated for all the people here who are running their own companies and the entrepreneurs here. You could really, really grow a company in this part of the world. Let me first turn to some of the global trends that allow this favorable environment to be available to companies here. The first one, of course, is the whole globalization trend. The fact is that in the last 30, 40 years, the world globalized. And concepts like offshoring, outsourcing, these are all the trends that allow companies in this part of the world, taking advantage of the fact that we're in the less developed parts of the world, Asia primarily, with a really hard-working population. In many, many areas, we benefit from the outsourcing and the offshoring of production processes, manufacturing, and even now services from the more advanced economies of America and Europe to this part of the world. And that's what enabled the growth potential to be there for small companies. And coupled with that, though, is another concept, which I'd like to share with you, is that the idea that companies nowadays all around the world, no matter where they are talking about specialization. What is my core competence? If an area is not my core competence, I would let somebody else do it. The whole idea of outsourcing. And I think that would drive the opportunities for smaller companies in this part of the world. And that has driven opportunities for smaller companies in this part of the world. And Li & Fung certainly is a big beneficiary of that trend. We basically, I think the manufacturers here who took production from companies in America and Europe in the early days of Hong Kong's industrialization, the 50s and 60s. My father, when he ran the company, we're the third generation now involved with the company. I always say that in every culture, there's this unfortunate talk about third generations. The Chinese will say, 富不過三代, wealth never passed beyond 3 generations. I'm the third generation, luckily. My kids might have a problem. They would say, Dad, what do you do with everything? But anyway, so when my father ran the company, we witnessed what Hong Kong witnessed was really the beginning of the whole globalization process. And Vincent was absolutely right. He was not just the only one. Many of my friends talked to me in 1972, 73 when I came back and says, William, what are you doing back in your family business? This whole idea of manufacturing for export using the cheap labor, that's history now. We're too expensive. And the word at that time was everything's gone to Taiwan. So we followed that trend. And Victor and I then, my brother Victor and I run the company. He's really the brains in the family. I'm just the doer. But I know many of you will know the joke we have in the company. You know, his name is Victor, right? So V is for vision. So he's the visionary. My name is William, right? W, you know what that stands for, work. But anyway, so we followed the business and went and set up in Taiwan. Guess what? 6 months after we set up in Taiwan, my own new staff came to me and says, you know, Mr. Fong, we don't know why you've come to Taiwan because we finished here. Everything's gone to Korea. So we set up in Korea. And pretty soon, all the countries in Southeast Asia, you know, Indonesia, you know, at that time, even Singapore, you know, Philippines, Thailand, they were all in this game. Okay, but I will talk about China later and the impact that has on everything. But generally speaking, you know, that period really was a beginning, and it intensified. This whole idea of globalization intensified, the offshoring of production, and the idea that companies no longer do everything themselves, but they actually contract it out. If somebody else, if it's not their core competence or it's not something that they think is central strategically to their company, they would subcontract it out. And that provided really a lot of opportunity for SMEs in this part of the world, taking advantage of our labor costs, taking advantage of the lowering transportation costs throughout the 60s and the 70s, taking advantage of the lowering of trade barriers that allow trade to flow easily on products. And then, of course, recently you talk about services, exportable services. You know, how many of us 15 years ago would have thought that a lot of the programming in the IT is now done in Bangalore, India? Okay, so these are the trends that really underlie the opportunities for the smaller companies to grow and grow very rapidly. Because luckily, we happen to be situated in a part of the world, okay, where we have the advantages of both the labor force, you know, and other things that allow us to grow faster than other parts of the world, maybe compared to South America or Africa, other places. So we were in the right time, the right place. And the right place, nothing is more right for us than what happened with China. Let me just share with you some of our concept about China and where it's going, especially in terms of its impact on SME opportunities. You know, for some strange reason, China seemed to develop in 30-year cycles, modern China. From 1949 to 1979, those 30 years, the world did not have China. The world lost China. China closed in on itself, and people went around setting up what we talked about, the globalization, the supply chain, the global supply chains, and so on, without thinking about China at all, those 30 years. From 1979 to 2009, and I'll tell you in a minute why we picked the year 2009, it's exactly 30 years, China burst on the world with Deng Xiaoping opening up China. And that impact, everyone here I'm sure is well familiar with. China burst on the world scene with 25% more labor force, very industrious, very anxious to get ahead, okay, and they conquered the world in terms of making products for the world. That was the era, that was the 30 years where I would say that China basically became the factory of the world. Now, I'm not going to talk about that because you're well familiar, and people took advantage of that. We did, we certainly did. 50% of our production now is out of China. Many companies like ours, based in Hong Kong, in Taiwan, in Korea, even in Japan and other places, took advantage of China's rise, including Chinese companies themselves. And we latched on to this Chinese growth engine, and we took off for 30 years. And that, however, is changing, more subtly, but it's changing. What happened? In the year 2000, end of 2009 and beginning of 2010, I'm sure many of you will know, and Cher will certainly know, about Foxconn, probably the world's largest factory group. 800,000 to about 1 million workers in China. Nothing is bigger, as far as I know. What happened, though, in the spring of 2010 and the end of 2009 is that there was a mysterious string of suicides of young workers at Foxconn. And Terry Gao, the owner, Terry's attitude to that was that maybe I'm not paying them enough. So he doubled the wages of his workers over a period of about 6 months. Now, all of you here who worked in China knows that something like that does not happen unless the All China Federation of Trade Unions say it's okay. And the All China Federation of Trade Unions would not say okay unless the leadership in China decided it's okay. In fact, what has happened is that in the 30 years from 1979 to 2009, China, because of its prowess in the export side, have built up such an unsustainable balance of payments problems with the recipient countries of the US and Europe that people don't think, including leadership, think that that can continue for too long like that. By the same token, because it's so export-oriented, the economy at that time in China, and certainly Li Yinfeng is a recipient of that, beneficiary of that move, there's the discrepancy in income between the coastal area and the internal of China is also something that is not sustainable for China in the long term. And so at some point, and the point we thought was really 2010, China decided we need to switch gears and develop a second engine for growth. And herein lies the new opportunity for people like us and the SMEs based in this part of the world. And I'm focusing on Hong Kong, but the same would probably apply to Taiwan and the mainland. You know, it seems like that our speakers are sort of from these three places. And that is that China now finally switched gears and bought onto the idea that we can grow the economy now, or we have a second engine for growth, which is going to be domestic consumption. And we should rely less on the export side. And in fact, the way we solve the trade imbalance problems is by making our goods more expensive, not by changing the exchange rate. Okay, they've learned what happened with the Japanese, with the Plaza Accord in the 80s, when they were forced, you remember, many of you will remember in the 80s, Japan was conquering the world. They were buying Rockefeller Center. And the US and the Western powers basically forced Japan to increase the exchange rate by about 30%, the Plaza Accord. And a lot of my Japanese friends still blame that for the doldrums in Japan to this day. So China is not going to change the exchange rate in a big jump. They'll gradually appreciate it, the general feeling. And all my professors are here. I hope they agree with me. But what they're going to do is we're going to make our goods more expensive by making the wages go up. But the benefit to the domestic economy is that the money goes in the pocket of the workers. The workers will do two things with it. Either they spend it, good for the domestic consumption economy, or they will send it home. A lot of them come from Sichuan and Hunan and other interior provinces, and therefore bridge some of the inequality gap between the coastal area and the middle. So it seems like there was a very clear signal that China was changing tact. And in fact, that was enshrined in the 12th five-year plan, the present one, where Li Keqiang said that they expect wages, average minimum wage in China, to grow at about 13% a year, every year for the next 5 years. That really means China's wages will go up by over 80% in the next 5 years. This is a simple way of looking at it. And again, I apologize to my professors all sitting here, but business guys operate with simple concepts. This is not a simple concept. So, however, what will happen now is that China in the next 30 years, our prediction is from 2009 to 2039, China will be the world's largest consumer market. We think in 30 years they will overtake the United States. And you would say that, hey, aren't they number 2 economy already? If you don't take EU as one economy, and there's a big question mark over that. And I'm not qualified to talk about that. Many people who are much better. But basically, in 2000, don't forget, China's share of GDP at domestic consumption is very low. It's in the 30 percentage points versus about 70% for the US. So in order to catch up with the US, not only do you have to catch up in terms of size of the economy, but you've got to double the ratio of domestic consumption. And again, that's in the 5-year plan. They're talking about retail growth of 15% versus the 7% overall GDP growth as the planned target for the 12th 5-year plan. So domestic consumption or retail will grow at double the rate. And therein lies the second opportunity. Because in these 30 years, 2009 to 2039, China will fulfill its second promise of being the world's largest consumer market. And so, Li Yinfeng, we ourselves, are turning our attention to how do you now take advantage of China's growing domestic market and the retail market. And I think there'll be so many opportunities for companies based here. Because if you look at the way I see companies in Hong Kong and coming to Hong Kong now, if you look at Hong Kong in relationship to these 30-year periods, from 1949 to 1979, Hong Kong was actually in a very precarious position. Because prior to that, Hong Kong was China's entrepot. Before the Second World War and the communist takeover, Hong Kong was China's entrepot. And they lost that function completely in 1949 when China closed in. They were very lucky. People like my father's generation, and maybe some of you sitting here, changed the economy around in Hong Kong to export, manufacturing and export. But again, that was not sustainable because Hong Kong is a small market in terms of labor, and that's what happened in the globalization. But then in the next period, 1979 to 2009, Hong Kong turned towards supporting the growth in China and the production in China. That's what Reinventing does. Of the 3 old pillars that our chief executive, Donald Tsang, talked about, one was trade, the other was finance, and the third was logistics. We were certainly involved in the trade side and somewhat in the logistics side. We were helping China export during that period. And as a result, a lot of entrepreneurs here, a lot of smaller companies here benefited a lot, in that era. Now, what will happen in the next 30 years is that while 1979 to 2009, I would say that Hong Kong acted like China's window looking outwards. In other words, we exported through Hong Kong. So companies like ours that exported, prospered. The big companies in the West who sourced from China put their buying offices here. Companies in China who exported set up the export sales offices here. Hong Kong became China's window looking outwards. In the next 30 years, 2009 to 2039, when the domestic market is going to start to be more important. Not that the export market is going away. That's much longer talk than we have time for today. But on the domestic front, we think that Hong Kong could become now the window looking inwards to China, finally. So now Hong Kong becomes the window where you can penetrate the Chinese market, where you can do things like finance your goods, you can inventory your goods. Hong Kong's a free port, plus other areas, the special economic zones in China will help as well. You start to basically look at the opportunities as presented by China as the world's, or going to be the world's biggest consumer market. And I think that's really the opportunity now for the small and medium-sized enterprises. By the same token, not just for Hong Kong companies, but for other companies in the region, Taiwan, Korea, Japan, America. And also for Chinese companies who now want to turn around and import goods and ship to the domestic market. And China, you can imagine that as they get more expensive on the export side, will probably import from countries like Vietnam, Bangladesh, other areas. And pretty soon there'll be a much more balance. It'll be global. Companies like ours will be sourcing globally and selling globally, including China, and eventually India at some point. The ascendance of Asia, again, I don't need to tell everybody here, it's obviously something that's very much on our minds. So I think that, if I could just sum up, I think the opportunities for small and medium enterprises based in Hong Kong, looking at the world market and also the China market, is entering a whole new era where the Chinese market is becoming very important, and we can switch gears somewhat. On the other hand, the export side is still very much there, and Hong Kong is still a great place. Our financial infrastructure, our legal infrastructure, our currency, our separate currency, all that contributes to making Hong Kong really a great place to do business. And of course, I focus on the area I know best, but I could tell you that in general, my general feeling about opportunities for small and medium-sized enterprises is that by definition, small and medium-sized enterprises probably does not have the financial muscle or the large capital that some companies need to be, for example, a financial institution. I was talking to Professor Chen here just now, and I agree 100% with him. However, there are service-related financial businesses, fund management, things like that, which Hong Kong is another great place, and to take advantage of Hong Kong as a financial center, that is very good for small and medium-sized companies that are service-oriented rather than capital-intensive and manufacturing-intensive. And the idea of Hong Kong becoming the service center for China, both as a window looking out as well as a window looking in, is really the future of Hong Kong and the small enterprises here, small and medium-sized enterprise, which Reinventing very much was. We were a small enterprise. I wish it was smaller. It's kind of... Well, thank you very much. Thank you.
William, very good. You've answered one of my questions. But what I really want to talk to you about is, how did you come up with the supply chain management concept? Because at that time, it was really way ahead of everybody else. Of course, now, afterwards, everybody's saying, yeah, it's so obvious.
Well, first of all, unfortunately, the term supply chain management is so overused that every truck driver thinks he's a supply chain manager. The second thing is that, people have asked me the question. They said that, look, when your grandfather was in business in 1906 in China, surely there was a supply chain. There's always been a supply chain. Somebody produced the raw materials, somebody produced intermediate components, somebody assembled it, and so on. There's always a supply chain. What's different between today's supply chain and yesterday's supply chain? I can give you the theoretical answer, not that it's easy to achieve, is that the supply chain of yesterday was a supply chain where all the players along the supply chain was basically adversarial. They were all buying and selling relationships up and down the supply chain. So if I charge you less, Vincent, you gain advantage. You know, if you can get it cheaper from me, you've gained advantage, and so on, right? But the supply chain of the future, or today or the future, is that it's a cooperative supply chain. We actually look at ourselves as allies against another company's supply chain. So Walmart's supply chain versus Target's supply chain is supply chain versus company versus company. And the idea of being cooperative is that because we basically need to work together to make sure that this is very complex now. In order to make a world-class product, you need a supply chain that is global, with all the problems of the shipping times and, you know, and the intricacies of that. Look what happened in Japan, the disruption in the supply chain. People are actually squeezing the supply chain too tight now. They've optimized it so much there's no room. They've single-sourced many things. So when something like that happens in Fukushima in Japan, people's supply chain was disrupted for months. When the floods happened in Thailand, people's supply chain was disrupted for months. You need to build in some redundancy. But the general feeling still is that with the complexities of the supply chain, you really have to work together with every partner along the supply chain. And that's really what Li and Fung does. We manage that supply chain, those relationships, to make it a cooperative supply chain. And you basically try to fight the next guy's supposed supply chain, all the way down to the consumer level.
William, let's now turn back to your transformation. You took over the business with a lot of your relatives and old staff working in the company. What did you have to deal with, and how did you deal with them?
Okay, well, I've talked about that sort of many times in my earlier days, the sort of transformation of, basically, on the one hand, we use the word SME in this conference. On the other hand, SMEs are basically individuals, and then especially in Asia, the family companies. Okay, they were very individual-oriented or family-oriented. So one of the first challenges that Victor and I had when we came back was that how do you transform that, which is a very intimate, it has certain very good values, but it also has some setbacks, you know, including how do you make professional management, how do you expand if it outgrows the family's resources in terms of management skills or even financial resources. How do you get professional management to willingly come in and work, you know, in a family company? So, of course, the first thing we did, which we did very early on, I came back in the summer of 72. By March of 73, we had taken it public, was that we basically separated ownership and management by taking the company public. That was a very important step, and I still advise that for most family companies. The idea
but that's easier said than done, because most of your relatives, I'm sure, did not feel that way. The public is actually just giving them a bit more money in the pocket, that's all.
No, it regularizes. See, the thing is, in the old days, you know, and without specifically talking about my family, very much, you know, these family companies would have a patriarch, and a lot of times the benefit you derive if you're another sort of relative in the family would be subject to what the patriarch wants to do. So if there's a period of big investment, there will be no dividends, for example. You know, so sometimes there's more. So the idea of going public, you bring in public scrutiny. You bring in outside directors. You bring in a regular dividend policy. And you bring in value for your shares. Even if you're not going to sell it, the banks will take it as collateral. So all those things combine to make the separation of ownership and management much more palpable and easier to accept by the family. So in the old days, maybe the family company said that, well, we'll always guarantee a relative a job. That no longer needs to be the case, because your ownership, you can benefit from your ownership by not working in the company. And that was the essential. For us, that was really an essential step.
I'm going to ask you a very sensitive question.
Please don't.
Both you and Victor's children are now getting into the business. Are you now rebuilding the family business?
Well, I think there's always need once in a while to regroup. Like Victor and I regrouped, you know, to give people who don't know us some idea. You know, when my grandfather, who started the company, his claim to fame was he could speak English. That's why he went into the business. And his other attribute was that he was a Catholic. So he only had one wife. That helps. However, my grandmother, I only have one grandmother. The grandmother, but my grandmother had 11 children. And Victor and I have something like 30-something cousins. So it was an extended family in the traditional Chinese family company sense of the word. And yes, of course, there were problems. But and what we found was that after a while, the attention and the interest of the family gets diffused. And once in a while, it's necessary to pull it back. And that's what we did in '89. We actually had a 3-year hiatus where we took the company private, reorganized it. But when we took it private, we reconcentrated ownership in Victor and my hands, the third generation. The second generation, at that time, you remember, everyone here will remember, the negotiations with China were taking place in the '80s. There was uncertainty. Many of the people in Hong Kong, were concerned about Hong Kong going back to China. A lot of them were, my father's generation was at the retirement age, at an age where they think about estate and other things. And it was an opportune time for us to say that, why don't we regroup? And what Victor and I did was actually we did a management buyout, and we leveraged some of the assets we didn't want, and then we regrouped the company, and the ownership reconcentrated back in Victor and my hands. So we'll probably need to do the same thing. As the family gets like this, you pull it back together again. And, people have different interests in life. Fortunately or unfortunately, I think our Victor and my kids have more, they enjoy life a lot more than we do. Put it that way. This work thing. My hair is whiter than yours. And he's older.
William, Li and Fung is very famous for the 3-year plan. Can you share that with our audience here?
Well, most of you who've been to business schools, Steve is laughing because I have this running dialogue with him. The way planning is taught in most business schools is something called a rolling plan. That means every year you project forward 3 or 5 years or 10 years, depending what your long-term plan is. We actually were very impressed, and we learned a big lesson from the Chinese Communist Central Planning System. Their 5-year plans are fixed plans. They don't move it. It's not like one is rolled. They don't move the goalposts every year. So what we have found on a practical level is that most management do not look at your long-term plan if it keeps moving every year. They just say, why bother? It's going to change again next year. Especially when the financial tsunami, all bets are off and they change the plan again, usually revising it down. But we like the Chinese way of doing things and saying that my 5-year plan is fixed. For us, 5 years is a bit too long, so we do 3 years. So our 3-year plan is fixed. And we like that system. And a lot of our own people, if you talk to our own senior management, will tell you that was one of the reasons why, we keep growing. Because every 3 years we focus. We focus on achieving the goals, and it takes 3 years. The 1-year plan or the budget, the annual budget is not enough to do any kind of investment. It's very short term. 3 years for our business is about right. It may not be right for other business like yours. The real estate might be different, the cycle. But for us, the 3-year plan is just about right.
You have now been practicing the 3-year plan for over 20 years. Did you fall down on your targets? How many times?
Several times. But by now, we were quite lucky. Your
company is still growing at over 30% per annum.
Yeah, but sometimes our target's higher than 20%. We never change our plan targets. So if you fail, you own up to it. You don't try to blame this or that. You just say that I just didn't make it. That's it.
So 2 questions related to that. So all your executives' remuneration is tied to the 3-year plan?
Yeah, very much geared toward not only the remuneration, it's also their career. See, if you think about it, one of the biggest complaints most executives have in corporations is that life is like a treadmill. Every year it's got to be better than the year before. It never stops. And people get tired, they burn out. Whereas we basically focus them on the 3-year span. So, Vincent, this 3 years, you manage Bangladesh for me. After 3 years, okay, maybe after the Bangladesh, we may give you a plusher job somewhere else. But you just focus your life around these 3 years, and they find it much easier to say that, okay, these 3 years, and what we promise them also is that during these 3 years, we won't detract you from this by telling you to do this and that. Pretty much is set. You pretty much know what you're going to do. You can talk to your wife and family, and you say, okay, these 3 years, this is what I'm going to do. And you have, I think, sufficient time to achieve. We think 3 years, again, is about right for us. 1 year is too short, and 5 years might be too long for our kind of business, which changes a lot.
So if people don't perform, they get demoted or they get laid off?
Now, in that whole area of dealing with people, if you ask me, what did you learn at the Harvard Business School that you didn't use? I think the only books I could burn from the Harvard Business School, everything to do with psychology and human behavior, because that's very Western-based. See, our view is that companies really operate in the environment of the society and the community they're in. You cannot be that different. and without, I hope I don't offend anybody here, but see that the GE Jack Welch idea of sort of firing the bottom 10% every year, for me, it doesn't work. It doesn't work in an Asian society where people treasure more loyalty. People, hou tao hou mei, they in careers, sorry, that means, anyway, it's not the kind of culture where if you fire somebody, you have a guard escort him to the desk, make sure it doesn't take away company secrets, and escort him out. That's not the culture. So at that whole area, we are much more, and a lot of that is taught by my father, rather than by books in the school. He would tell me things like, you can imagine, I was 23 when I came back in the family business. And I thought I knew everything because Harvard Business School taught me everything, right? So I would tell my father, hey, these guys are all dead wood, they're not pulling their wood, they're not efficient. And then he would tell me things like, that guy over there, he saved the company 4 years ago because he did some deal. And, and he taught me the fact that people are not machines, so they have their cycles, ups and downs. Could be an illness, could be a divorce, could be anything. And sometimes if you nurture them through that period, they come back and become great managers for you and very loyal. So that's the culture we're in. And as a result, no, the simple answer to your question is no. We take, and a lot of times, and I said that to Steve's class the other day, a lot of times the fault is not the person, but the company. The whole thing about Peter Principle, you promote somebody to the level where they're incompetent. A lot of times it's not that they are incompetent, but you put them in the wrong job. So it's the company's fault, not the people's fault. And if they're in the right job, maybe they could be great stars. And the problem with promotions, a lot of times you promote people to different jobs without giving them adequate training. So a lot of times the doers do very well, and then you promote them to manager job where they get other people to do a lot and things like that. And so I think the company must first ask itself, is that right person in the right job before you say that person is not competent or whatever.
I'm surprised I'm not getting any questions from the floor, so I must be doing okay. William.
The fact that he didn't ask.
Okay. How to motivate the post-80s, 80後. Big question.
First of all, I think the post-80s, the 80後, actually, I think their view on life is probably better than ours. It's more rounded. It's more even. It's less skewed towards just work and and money and success and all that. I think in many ways they're probably better, and I think you've got to take into account this changing milieu. And I could tell you, especially in China, because China underwent the biggest social experiment ever taken by any country, and that is the one-child policy, which means that you now have children whose whole life growing up, they were doted upon by 6 parents, father, mother, and then the 2 grandmothers. So their view of life is totally different from like yours, where you grew up with so many brothers, you have to fight for food at the table. Okay, it's different.
Knows.
That's why the brothers are so competitive.
Right.
See, I hate being interviewed by him without getting back at him somehow.
That's what friends are for. Big corporations. How do you balance between corporate social responsibility and profit making?
Well, again, we have first of all, let me just say that most of the stuff I talk about, this theoretical, comes from Victor. Okay, not from me. But he's the brains in the fat. He thinks of all these things. But I can tell you one concept we have is that, in the old days, I would say even 10, 15 years ago, the society basically operated on the principle that government sets a boundary within which business operates. And as long as you operate within those boundaries, and usually it's the legal boundaries, you're okay. Okay, and the idea also is very Western, it's very American. The idea that is the letter of the law you have to obey, not the spirit. Okay, that was the modus operandi. But what people have seen in the last few years, especially through the financial tsunami and now, is that maybe the government is either incapable or incompetent to set the boundaries properly, or worse still, they've been co-opted by big business to change those boundaries to the disadvantage of the small guys. So now it's up to each company to set its own boundaries and operate within something that's socially acceptable. Now, if you think back, both China and Southeast Asia has always had that system because the legal system wasn't that perfect. And companies always have to operate within their own boundaries. And I think that's what you're seeing, is that in terms of issues on sustainability, pollution, workplace, social compliance, and so on, that companies have to set their own boundaries, something that's accepted by the community they operate in, and not by some government thing. So I think that's the trend. So I think companies will have to be very, very cognizant of that and operate that way.
We're getting quite a few questions. In a fast-changing environment today, is it plausible for small enterprises to also have fixed targets over 3 years, or should we be more flexible?
Yeah, I think, the 3 years, again, let me just reiterate, it depends on your industry you're in. Some industries may be even faster than 3 years. Some industries are a lot slower because big projects like your real estate projects, a longer gestation period. You're building a big factory that requires a lot of capital expense, and fixed facilities. So that varies. But 3 years for me is just about right for the trading business. And it might be right for something like the retail and other sort of less capital intensive businesses. And the world is changing very quickly. The only thing you can say about change in the world is that not only is it constantly changing, but the rate of change is accelerating. And I think 3 years is still about right. So far, we've been operating on 3 years. We haven't changed it for 20-something years. Seems to work for us.
This question, I also have a question for you along the same lines. You have made over 40 acquisitions in the growth of Li & Fung. How did you integrate them all into your business? And this one is actually, the question is, how do you integrate all the acquisitions into a family company?
Okay, first of all, you see this white hair. It used to be black. Now, first of all, let me tell you about our views about acquisition. A lot of people think that we only grow by acquisitions. That's not true. What we have is basically, what we're saying is that if you want to grow in good times and bad times, you must have a strategy that takes care of the bad times too. And the way we look at organic growth and inorganic growth or acquisitions is that it's two sides of the same coin. When business is bad in general, like we're going into this period perhaps now, where your organic growth is low, it's also a good time to do acquisitions because companies are cheaper. And vice versa. When times are good, you can grow organically and you don't need to do acquisitions. And also acquisitions may be very expensive. So we actually work these two strategies in tandem. Okay. Now, in terms of integrating these companies, one thing that we don't want to do at Li & Fung is be a conglomerate. So when we integrate when we take over a company, we integrate it into Li & Fung. However, recognizing that the reason we bought the company usually is because of the front end, customer relationships, product skills, and so on. But the back end can certainly be integrated, right? All the accounting, finance, HR, IT, all that stuff. So the integration is very important, but that's only integration in terms of people and maybe process, but not in culture. The most important is actually culture. And the way we integrate other companies in the culture is to have a very open-ended culture ourselves. We cannot be so proud to say that we must have the best culture because we're buying you. What you have to do is have an open-ended culture where the company you acquire can do something better than you. You've got to say that, okay, now I don't want to have a conglomerate. I don't want to have 10 cultures in the company, but if what you're doing in that area is better than what I'm doing, I'll change the whole company and incorporate your culture. That way we try to create a culture for the whole company.
But that must come from you because your staff, your executives will not accept that, right? They have the mentality that I'm taking you over, you better follow.
No, see that's a mistaken, I think it's something we try to change very hard. You see, even things like, most people, when they look at companies to acquire, they always say that, okay, the synergy comes from getting rid of expenses, right? And the presumption is that since I'm acquiring you, your people goes. But how do I know that your people in a certain function is not better than my people? So what you should do is bring them in first. And then if there's excess, you rationalize. But luckily for us, we've been growing quite fast, so we've been able to take care of a lot of people, without a lot of redundancies. But having said that, the idea is that you cannot have the presumption that the acquirer is always better than the acquiree in certain functions.
Okay, last question from the floor. Given Hong Kong's dependence on China for its business, do you think it is important for companies to diversify across different countries in Asia outside of China? Yeah,
my only suggestion is that in the world today, you've got to take a global view. China had its moment in time for certain types of businesses, and that might be fading a bit, a la what I said earlier about wages in China rising. So you must always be shifting, and your organization should probably not be geographic, but it should be more by either product or by, in our case, by customer. You see, when we organize our business, we say that here's a team that does this customer. This is not the China team. This is not the Bangladesh. This is the Kohl's team. This is the Walmart team. And where they source, okay, is where the market naturally leads them. And you follow the geography fades. You know, we basically should look at a world without borders. And you guys can't say China is the place. You're just going to say that, okay, we're in the business of providing garments for Walmart, and if this year is China, 5 years' time it could be Vietnam. 10 years' time it could be Bangladesh, or even now. 20 years' time it could be Africa. And you basically shift that way. The geographic limit, you should not limit yourself in a geographical way, even with China, such an important country as China.
Well, I, as the moderator, will have the privilege of the last question.
Easy one.
No. William and his wife Sylvia would occasionally call us and say, Vincent, let's go out for dinner and let's go to a movie. When I'm working my tail off and then he asks me to go out for movies, he must be a very good time manager. Can you share with us?
Let me just share with you what Victor Fung says about time management. When people ask him, how do you spread your time? He usually say, well, I spend 50% of my time at Li & Fung. I spend 50% of my time doing various pro bono government things. I spend 50% of my time with things, non-profit organizations, and I spend 50% of my time with my family. That's how he allocates time.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking William and what's important.
Thank you.